Okay, so this is it. The final section of this whole series of videos about Vim and Emacs and the editor war in general. In this section, I want to give my personal conclusion to the whole thing, basically. And hopefully by the end of it, you might gain some sort of insight that you might not have had before. Okay. So first, I just want to go through my experience and my current setup. So currently I use Vim and Emacs, each for their sort of areas that I think they're really good for. And so I separate them, basically. I use Vim for my programming and I use Emacs for like prose and stuff. So I use both. I use both for things that I think they are really good at or better than the other, right? Also, it's worth noting I value minimal customization. I don't want to be dependent ultimately on any big feature, any big configuration sort of setup. So I don't configure Vim or Emacs heavily. And you would have seen this in the features section where I just showed you my vimrc and .emacs file. And in that you saw those files were fairly small. I only edit options that are offered by default. I don't add any external plugins. I don't add any external packages. So yeah, that's the approach I want to take. Therefore, for me, it's not an option for me just to use Emacs because you can use all the Vim key bindings within Emacs by adding evil mode or using a distribution of Emacs like Doom Emacs, right? But I know I don't want to do that because I don't want to be heavily dependent on these big configurations. So that's why I use Vim and Emacs separately, because I want to be able to use these default key bindings on someone else's machine, or if I lose my configuration for whatever reason, I want to be able to use Vim or Emacs in their default state with their default behavior efficiently. So yeah, I don't want to customize my Vim or Emacs that much, if at all. So yeah, when it comes to my programming setup, I prefer a terminal-based workflow for portability and simplicity. Like if I'm if I'm going to someone else's computer or using their computer, I know it has a terminal. Therefore, if I'm comfortable with a terminal-based workflow, I will be comfortable with any computer that has a terminal, which is basically every computer, right? Every computer basically has a terminal emulator within its operating system. But anyway, it's also, I find, simpler because with an IDE, for example, you have all this stuff going on. It's just harder for me to focus. I mean, I like just one thing at a time. And the other good thing about a terminal-based workflow is that you often interact with tools and programs in a very bare bones way. It's kind of like you have access to everything under the hood. Therefore, you get a better understanding, I think, of those tools and programs, right? So that's why I like a terminal-based workflow. But I also like the Vim approach when I'm editing code. That's why I use Vim here for programming. So the idea of text objects and motions and the idea of just launching or going into a text editor to do my editing and then jumping out back into the terminal, like I like that workflow. I like that workflow, especially with text objects, because in programming, you act on lines as the unit of editing. You act on text objects as the unit of editing. You act on curly braces, quotes, all these things. And all these things Vim offers. No, how would I say it? All of these things are able to be edited in Vim in a very quick way with its use of text objects. Yeah, so that's why I use Vim for programming. I like to separate my tooling ultimately. I like the bag of tools approach. We touched on this in the philosophy and approach section, right? I want to use specific tools for their specific purposes. So I like the idea of having a bag of tools, taking a tool out, using it, then putting it right back and just grabbing another tool, right? I don't really like the idea of a Swiss Army knife where I'm carrying the whole context of all my other tools with me in order to access this one other tool, right? But I do appreciate it, but I just don't like it as much, right? I just don't like it as much because I like to view things in a way where I can see what's going on. And when it comes to IDEs or the Emacs approach, where you got all these tools available to you, they can be good, but like I'd rather just interact with things through the terminal, the core terminal that I have on my system, because I know that is the most basic interface to my system. And so I know that whatever comes up on this terminal is kind of like the most, I don't know, apparent or the most transparent way of interacting with my system, right? Because there's nothing covering it up. There's no veil of added functionality or added environment on top of that. And I like that. I like that. So therefore, now for programming, I use Vim, but with Tmux, which is a terminal multiplexer, and that enables me to effectively use a terminal-based workflow. So yeah, that's the workflow I use. It's Tmux plus Vim, right? I said before that really when you're comparing Emacs and Vim, what you should compare is the Vim plus terminal workflow and the Emacs workflow. And so yeah, it's because really Vim is supposed to be used in a terminal workflow. So yeah, that's why I add this note about using Tmux, which I find quite neat. So yeah, that's what I use for programming at the moment. It's Vim plus Tmux. However, I do have a soft spot for Emacs. I like the Emacs approach, which is modeless editing, when I'm editing prose. It might change in the future because I do sometimes edit prose with Vim, but now I usually use Emacs. But yeah, it might change basically. It just might change. But I value Emacs modeless key bindings because when I'm using the keyboard and using Vim on prose, it doesn't make a lot of sense to edit text according to like text objects of whole paragraphs or, you know, curly braces, quote marks, parentheses. It doesn't make sense to operate on individual lines either, because usually a paragraph in a text file is one line, but it's wrapped, right? It's a big line. So I find the Emacs modeless sort of approach, as it is by default, very, very good for editing prose, basically. I also use org mode for Emacs, which is what I use for my personal scheduling, as well as some essays. But even then, now I'm using Vim for writing essays, just editing raw LaTeX in Vim. Again, it's this idea of kind of having the most transparent interface to my system and to my tools and what's happening, right? So I'd rather edit raw LaTeX, which I'm beginning to do more now, as opposed to editing org files, and then exporting that to a PDF via LaTeX. So I'd rather just interface with raw LaTeX. I have more control, it seems, right? But also with Emacs, I have access to Tetris, and I just have to show you this. Remember, Emacs is this whole idea about an environment that you use. So therefore, it should not be surprising that it has games, because that's included in your kind of environment of using a computer, right? So I can do Alt X or Meta X Tetris, and I will get Tetris. Look at that. Look at that. This is brilliant. This is all down to the way Emacs works. It works with buffers that are not necessarily interpreted as plain text. In this case, this buffer is interpreted as an interactive game of Tetris. And that's just cool. I mean, I just want to play this now for the whole rest of the video. I mean, this is great. I love Tetris. Anyway, Emacs has Tetris. Therefore, it is the best text editor available. Okay, that's a bit of a joke at the end, but it's just worth noting. If I wanted to play Tetris, I would probably just go into Emacs and play Tetris. But it has all these extra tools that I think are valuable, where I will just default to if I can't think of any other place to access those tools from. So Emacs has its place for me. It has a soft spot. So that's my setup at the moment. I use Vim for programming with Tmux, and I like the approach of a terminal-based workflow, basically. I don't want to customize Vim and Emacs. I want to keep them as close as possible to their default behavior so that I'm not dependent on any special feature, basically. But yeah, that's it. It's this whole idea of just getting used to them, and I think now that I have got used to Vim and Emacs to a considerable degree, I think I'm just fast and efficient in them, and I understand how they work, and it's yeah, going pretty good. Now, I just want to go through the bottom line for me. I hugely benefit from knowing both tools. I use Vim for programming, I use Emacs for prose and maybe some other stuff like org mode. They are good for those things I want to do just in and of themselves. That's it. I just hugely benefit from knowing them both because if Emacs has something Vim doesn't, I can just go to Emacs. If Vim has something Emacs doesn't by default, I can just go to Vim. And this also is the case for Vim and Emacs key bindings, which is what I think I mostly benefit from. Like if I'm using VS Code or I have to use it for, I don't know, work, I would guess, I can just use a Vim plugin in VS Code and have all the Vim key bindings accessible to me in VS Code. Same with Emacs, probably for the terminal, right? I can access the Emacs key bindings that are embedded in the bash terminal by default. Control A, Control E for the beginning and the end of the line, for example, right? So I benefit from these key bindings mostly. And that's why I think learning both of these tools is hugely beneficial because it's probably the key bindings that you benefit from learning the most. But yeah, for me, I found that Emacs has a bunch of very useful tools like Dired, its file manager, even on Windows, like when I've had to use a Windows system and rename a lot of files based on searching for text and replacing that text like in bulk. Emacs in Dired mode allows you to edit a list of files as if they were text. So when you view the files in the Dired buffer, you can edit that text and then save the changes to that buffer, and it will write those new file names on disk, right? And that's pretty cool. I have not found a way to do that easily on Windows, so therefore, when I have used Windows and had to do that, I've gone to Emacs. I've used Dired. So I've found Emacs to have really useful tools, especially when all you have access to is a terminal. So yeah, usually for me, what that means is I'm most comfortable in a terminal because I'm familiar with a terminal. Therefore, I'd rather use a terminal application like Emacs and yeah, instead of a graphical user interface like application, a separate application. So yeah, I found, yeah, ultimately that Emacs is indeed powerful, but for any kind of programming, I like to have the most basic tools so that there is a minimal filter or a minimal veil between me and what is happening under the hood. That's why I like the terminal approach, the terminal based approach or based workflow, because there is just no filter. Like what I am seeing is the most transparent interface between me and the computer. And that gives me a lot of, I guess, security because I know I'm getting the full picture, right? So yeah, that's just the bottom line for me. I like Emacs, I find it very powerful, but most notably, Vim allows me to work in that terminal-based workflow in a lot more of a integrated or streamlined way because Vim is supposed to be worked in with a terminal-based workflow. It's supposed to be no, how can I say it? How did I put it before? It was like, yeah, that was it. Vim expects you to have a kind of terminal-based workflow where you hop into it and hop back out into the terminal and do other stuff, right? So that's why I use Vim for any kind of programming and compiling and yeah, basic editing as well. Like it just makes sense to me. But ultimately, the bottom line I have found is that there is a balance between efficient tooling and efficient use of tools by understanding what's actually happening on the computer under the hood. That's why I like the terminal-based approach or workflow, because there is this balance. Not only am I efficient or quick in using the tooling that I use, but I actually have an understanding of what's happening on the computer because of that, because I'm getting this transparent view of what's happening under the hood of the computer. So yeah, that's the balance I found. Ultimately, that is important for me. I could use VS Code or some other IDE and be really, really quick in editing text or making programs, but I think I know rather that I would lose that understanding of what's happening under the hood, because with IDEs, everything is so easily accessible. Everything is kind of filtered in an accessible way. But for me, I find that would be an obstacle. So yeah, that's the bottom line for me. And I just hope that that provides a bit of insight if you're thinking whether you should use Vim or Emacs, right? And so yeah, this is the answer I've come up with. And who knows, maybe it would change. Maybe I would find some other aspect in the future where my decisions on this matter might change, but I don't think that's likely. I think I've kind of gone through the rabbit hole deep enough, and this is the answer I've come up with basically, and I hope it's useful. And that's it. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I thank you especially if you've watched this whole series of videos, because it was not short. It was not short. So thank you for watching this whole series if that's what you have done. But with that, we've done it. We've done it. The editor war is over. There is peace in our times. Brilliant. So with that, I will thank you again. Thank you very much.